Everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Richard McCracken from the Case Centre, and I'll be your host for this session. The Case Centre is the independent home of the case method, and we're dedicated to advancing the case method worldwide. A case method that is diverse and reflects the lived experience of decision makers, teachers, and students from around the world. Alongside our case workshops and scholarships, this webinar series of programs is a key activity in our work to achieve that. So we're delighted today to partner with the Centre for Equity, Gender and Leadership, EGAL, at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business to bring you this interesting and very engaging discussion. We're really lucky to have Kellie McElhaney, founder and executive director of the Centre of Equity, Gender and Leadership, and Genevieve Macfarlane Smith, Associate Director of the Centre, as our speakers. And in a moment, I'll hand you over to Kellie and Genevieve. The session is designed to be highly interactive, so please feel free to ask questions or post any questions that you may have, and there will also be breakout sessions as well. Just as a final reminder, I'd say that we are recording the webinar, and that we'll send you a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. So now over to Kellie and Genevieve for what I'm sure will be an inspiring and very informative session. Kellie and Genevieve.
Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Very excited to be here with you all today. We're going to be sharing about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in business school cases and some of the work that we've done at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at UC Berkeley. So in terms of our agenda for the day, we're going to do a quick round of introductions, present on some background information work that we've been doing around the state of DEI in business school cases. And then we have a fun breakout group activity to get everyone talking and thinking about the topic. And then we'll share some final thoughts and some key takeaways. So to jump right into it, we would love if everyone could put their name in the chat and where they're calling in from. So just your name and where you're calling in from. And I will, while folks are doing that in the chat, I will share a little bit about myself. And I'm seeing we have folks from New York, from London, from India, from Chicago, from the UK, Salt Lake City, Copenhagen, Toronto. Wow, really, definitely a nice international mix of folks here. So I'm Berkeley, California, and have been working at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership for about 2.5 years. My background is in equity and inclusion within business and including within the workplace, as well as thinking about equity and inclusion in products and services and the supply chain as well. So really kind of the spread of the business value chain. And I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Kellie. Kellie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's so great to see the global audience since I feel like I sit in my own living room for most of my life recently. My name is Kellie McElhaney, and as Richard introduced me, I'm the founder of the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership and have been on the faculty at the Haas School of Business for nearly 20 years. And by far, this phase of my life, this potting, as I say it, it has been my favorite potting. Before I did this, I started the Center for Responsible Business at UC Berkeley, but this is my favorite work, right? Smack dab where we are today. So Jen, do you want to advance? I should also tell you that I have what was before 2020 known as the common cold and flu. I am COVID negative, but it is still miserable if you haven't had the common cold and flu for 2 years. So if I hack a little bit and turn my mute on, that's just to get me through. So Jen, if you'll just go to the next slide to talk about us. So who we are, again, Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, or EGAL, if you speak French, or egalitarian, you can see we're really excited with that acronym, although we do go much more broadly than just gender, but the acronym's too cool, so we decided not to rebrand. But we were founded at, I guess I founded us at the end of 2017 and now have the most amazing Team EGAL team around me. And our work spans 3 buckets. We really focus on, I kind of like to think about it as 3 communities. We focus on educational and learning opportunities, primarily for students, because we graduate over 1,000 leaders a year from Berkeley Haas across all of our degree programs. So our first area is to provide educational opportunities for our students, but we certainly also provide educational opportunities for the second of our communities, which is the business community, as well as through this case compendium, through our research community. We put out resources that are very practitioner oriented, data driven. We do support a significant amount of traditional faculty research through Haas, but we also focus, and I would say really double down on practitioner oriented, evidence-based research through our playbooks, and then our various playbook launches, roundtables, workshops, and seminar series. And the third is through our academic support. As I said, we support a significant amount of research for PhDs, postdocs, as well as professors at Haas, but throughout UC Berkeley. Just a couple of thoughts about what we believe. We really think this is a leadership movement. I mean, people talk about it being a moment. It's too late for moments. We need traction and a movement around just reimagining how we can use business as a driver for a more equitable and inclusive society. Just a few more thoughts about us. We think that business education needs an upgrade, both in traditional business schools, but also one of the things we hear a lot is from alums who are out there or corporations with whom we interact. We didn't have this kind of work when we were in business school. We didn't have classes on DEI. We didn't have classes that brought up issues of diversity and inclusion when we were here. And apropos to today, the amount of females who tell me they did not ever have a case when they were in business school that highlighted a female as a leader, as the protagonist in the case, as opposed to being in a support role. So that's just a little bit about us. And let's get into what's happening. What is the state of DEI in business school cases? Over to you, Genevieve.
So as some background, case studies, which are used in business schools globally, include primarily white male protagonists, and even cases with protagonists that are diverse tend to have different issues. They may show harmful stereotypes and norms that are and help perpetuate them. So for example, there's been trends around women depicted as more emotional, less visionary, less agentic than men. Female protagonists' credentials were mentioned more frequently in cases as opposed to their male colleagues. And these cases also tend to be in pink collar occupations. So there's a lack of key topics related to equity and inclusion as well that are really critical for businesses in an increasingly interconnected world and society. So thinking about the different ways that equity and inclusion in our society impacts business is often missing from cases and from many courses within business schools as well. Of course, just showing one model of leadership really signals that those who don't identify as that, and again, primarily we're seeing white male protagonists. So folks that don't identify as white and male are not suited for leadership. That's kind of the implicit signal that sends, the lack of diversity within cases, and deprive students of alternative role models for leadership identities. So these topics are really important, especially as at the Haas School of Business, diversity and inclusion is a key priority for the dean, and it's a key priority for the school. And we have increasingly focused on diversity within classes, but at the same time, the classes have not necessarily caught up to the diversity that's represented among our student body. And that's continuing to be an issue in terms of who's represented within cases. And there's building momentum among students and among the community for really wanting cases that represent the diversity of the community. And this is only increasingly so. So we did some research around business school cases, and we put together a compendium of different cases that had protagonists that we identified as diverse. And essentially that means cases of protagonists that were diverse among kind of gender, racial, ethnic, religious, etc. Different forms of different types of identity and different cases that we gathered and put together. In this research that we conducted, we found that there's overall a lack of diversity in business school cases, with only about 9.45% estimated of cases having female protagonists and only 1.3% of cases with Black protagonists. We also found that and this was estimates gathered from the Harvard Business Publishing Education Case Series, which comprised about 80% of cases used in business schools globally. And we made these estimates based on search terms that we used within the platform. The majority of cases cataloged with diverse protagonists that we found really do also focus on white women. So out of 215 cases that we were able to catalog, 83.7% portray a protagonist representing gender diversity, largely white cis female protagonists, and 28.84% highlight a protagonist representing racial and ethnic diversity or underrepresented minority. And several cases have a protagonist that's both female and an underrepresented minority. That was about 18.6%. The majority of cases related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that we cataloged also focus primarily on gender. 40.93% of the 215 cases had a focus on gender, followed by race and ethnicity at about 20%. And very few cases focus on DEI-related issues and opportunities for both race and gender. That was about 6%. And many DEI-related cases were kind of about culture more broadly, or about other kind of DEI-related issues and opportunities that did not have a particular identity of focus at all. So identities beyond gender, particularly cis female and or race and ethnicity, are really lacking, with some identities rarely represented within business school cases. So in the DEI-related case studies, only about 2% include discussions focused on diversity of abilities and immigrant or first generation and socioeconomic diversity. So there's definitely a lack of different types. Not only are we seeing both primarily white male protagonists in cases, but there's also just a lack of availability of cases representing other identities, especially beyond kind of white women, within cases that can be considered diverse. Since this is such a global audience, I will also note that the majority of cases are also very Western focused. And this is another large gap. There's a lack of cases of, especially in some of these larger platforms, of cases from low and middle income countries, and they're written by authors from low and middle income countries. A couple other things I'll say here is that, within the DEI cases, those are predominantly in human resource management and organizational behavior, with a focus on culture and employee representation, gaps and solutions. And among the DEI-related cases, the majority were in the most common topics within the DEI-related cases would be culture, followed by kind of diverse employee representation, gaps, and solutions. So that's a little bit of background around the research that we did. And I will also add that of the kind of HR and organizational behavior cases, the vast majority, 90%, have female protagonists. And again, lots of focus on kind of HR roles that are filled by women as opposed to other technical or P&L positions, which perpetuates the limiting narrative based on gender stereotypes of women being primarily in these certain types of positions within business. So that's a little bit of background around our case compendium and report. You can see the link to the report on the bottom. We definitely found that various cases had limiting stereotypes and harmful norms that were kind of perpetuated through some of the language that they used. So it's important too that in thinking about cases to use in your own classes, making sure that how those protagonists are represented is an important part of kind of the pre-work before using a case. So as I mentioned, we put together 2 different sections of our case compendium. So we have about 215 and growing cases that are focused on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So these can be topics related to culture. They might be related to tackling sex-based harassment in the workplace. They might be related to kind of some of these HR related concerns. But there's also topics such as thinking about marketing from an inclusive lens and thinking about products from an inclusive lens. So it's not only related to HR, but these cases primarily tend to be in that kind of HR culture component of business. Component of our case compendium is cases with diverse protagonists. So that's kind of what we talked about before. And on the compendium, you can search by identity, by year, by topic. So it's a really usable compendium to help identify cases for your own classes that you can use that have diverse protagonists and or that are about DEI related topics. Here, before we go to talking about some of the educational value.
Jen, sorry, we can't hear you. There you are. You have been going in and out a bit. Can't hear you. I think Jen might be having AirPod problems. Genevieve, if you'll just go to the next slide, I'll jump in. Those AirPods are expensive and not to be trusted is what I have found. Sorry, Apple. I'll just talk a little bit about the educational. I mean, I'm assuming you all are here because you fully grasp the educational value of having cases with diverse protagonists. Francesca LeBaron, who is a queer white female and was on our founding student board. I just love this quote. We got lots of powerful quotes from our own students. Francesca says, reading a case about a leader who I identified with would give me confidence and validation. Isn't education supposed to impart wisdom, but also impart a sense of validation for the student's identity and confidence that they can succeed in their chosen field? Even though I'm not named John, I have the lived experience worth sharing and a leadership style that can add value to my organization. In the US, it is still true that there are more CEOs named John and David in the Fortune 500 than there are female CEOs, period. So if you look at just the way that we show one model of leadership, and in my experience of being in the business school world now for a long time, the leader that we tend to highlight is this very loud, gregarious white male. If we don't see multiple models of leadership, it signals that women, people of color, LGBTQ are not suited for leadership. It deprives our students from alternative role models for different leadership identities. We know from the research that we conducted, students who are exposed to diverse business leaders benefit from what is called the role model effect. When they can relate to diverse leaders, they enjoy better self-perceptions. They feel more confident. And that, of course, pushes students to perform better when they have higher self-perceptions or when they feel more confident. Next slide, there you go. We also know that it fosters a sense of cultural sensitivity amongst students. So when they are in discussion groups about the case itself, students get more of a cultural awareness. It equips students to manage real life scenarios in which these varying lived experiences and diverse perspectives are at play in the real world on their teams, in their organizations. It prepares students to lead in a diverse workplace. In the United States, we have the most multicultural generation in the workforce and just entering the workforce ever. I'm obviously more knowledgeable about the US population, but in the US, in the most recent census, the white population in America did not grow for the first time ever. The significant growth in our Latinx or Hispanic population, in our Asian population. So it really equips our students to lead in truly today's workplace. And it allows students to engage in these discussions that are critical, that are timely, and that often are uncomfortable. So preparing students in the safety of a business school setting, not to say it's wildly safe, but could feel safer than when they are actually out in the work world. It allows these students to have what can be challenging, uncomfortable, difficult, but wildly illuminating and aperture opening discussions in the classroom. You all are out there doing this. What other value do you see in terms of having cases that both bring in DEI issues as well as highlights diverse protagonists? What are some other benefits that you see out there? We would love to hear from the audience. And I think Kate or Genevieve, I'm not seeing the whole room because of the way my monitor is set. So if you want to call on people. Oh, great, Rushi, I'd love to hear if people want to speak up, because I'd love to hear not just beneficial for students. Rushi, I don't mean to cold call you, but we're all
no, that's fine. I just think that there's, kind of a broader, like there's so many things we can do in the EDI space to make change, and every little bit helps. And it's not just in one area or one group or one person. So to the extent that we're having these conversations, or as I think about trying to have these conversations with our own faculty, I think then it's not just about the students in the classroom, but it's about how we're engaging with our other faculty and administrators, and what that says to our broader community as we start doing this work, or continue, hopefully, that this is just yet another angle and gives maybe another option to folks. Because I think sometimes having those conversations in the classroom, some people are ready for that, some people aren't, that maybe a case is a way for a given faculty member, for example, to engage in work of EDI that might feel more sort of comfortable with for them.
Yeah. And Catherine, I'll get to your comment. I want to go to Denise, but Rushi, I totally agree. It's hard for a professor just to insert DEI if it's not naturally, or I think you called it EDI. It's so funny, we call it something different everywhere, but it's hard for a faculty member to insert and not feel like it's contrived. So to have it naturally come up in the case discussion, and I can give you my thoughts, Catherine, after I go to Denise, on how to facilitate and strategies for these difficult conversations. And it is tough. Berkeley feels like it's the top of the pack, given just the environment of Berkeley, where it's tough to bring these conversations up. Denise, and then I'll come back to that question.
Great, thank you, Kelly. I really appreciate this venue and the discussion. What I find in teaching, and I'm at San Francisco State, my undergrad students are much more amenable to jump in and tackle some of these issues around DEI than my graduate students.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to know, I'm just thinking of it as we're engaging here. Have there been studies indicating what are the differences between undergraduate students and graduate students? And it might be a regional issue as well. I don't know. But it's harder for me to get my graduate students to really engage with tough topics.
Yep. I think you're hitting something near and dear to me, and I won't go off on a tangent. Genevieve's like freaking out right now, but I absolutely prefer the undergraduate classroom. They're willing to get in there to share their own lived experience in a much more vulnerable, sort of untainted way. I suspect perhaps the MBAs have been beaten up a little bit because they've been out in the work world. I experience a lot more fear in the classroom in the MBA world. This is just my own experience, primarily from those who feel that they are earlier on in their, what we call equity fluent leadership, or DEI, or JEDI. I love JEDI. It's also my favorite acronym, Rushi. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. They really got the best acronym. But what I hear, and just to edify, my white men say, I'm scared to speak up. I'm scared to mess up. I don't know what intersectionality means. I can't ask that ignorant sounding question. Just a few strategies, and then I'll move on to other question askers. I do set ground rules. I think it was Catherine who asked this. I set ground rules on the first day, sort of classroom norms around respect, listening, curiosity, not judgment, really sort of doing what you can. So they look to me to create a psychologically safe environment. And this semester, more than ever, I have said that is a group effort. That is not my role. We are co-creating a classroom environment. So what I also learned is I can't just show those norms day one. I pretty much am showing them every other week just to remind people. Small group, small group, small group. one-on-ones, because for those who are incredibly uncomfortable in a large group conversation with people who maybe self-deem that they are farther along on their journey, their voices are the loudest, they speak up the most. So what my students tell me ad nauseum is just put us pair and share, then make the groups 3, then 4, but they just don't feel comfortable, particularly at the beginning, in a large group. So that's kind of, and I also require my students to get up, move, and find somebody that they haven't spoken with, because they sit in friend groups. We, homophily, likes, you can see that, I'm sure, in your classrooms. I see it in my classroom. So I make them every class get up and find somebody you haven't spoken to yet. There's a wealth of information on this call if others have ideas, because I think it's a great question, Catherine. Any other hands?
Richard, did you want to say something about the point in the chat?
Yeah, just I'm really excited by this discussion around the case method, and I the studies that you've been talking about so far are really very worrying but very valuable in highlighting some of the barriers that the use of non-diverse cases may impose in the classroom. But I'm excited by the possibility of or the potential of the case method to be an agent of change here, because the case method itself is based around having students collaborate in coming to reaching decisions around scenarios that are full of complexity and ambiguity, and which is the feeling that many people have around discussing DEI. So I think that the case classroom is a really ideally well-positioned environment in which to have these discussions. And if you can't have difficult or uncomfortable discussions in a case classroom, then I can't imagine where you would be able to have them. I think it's so I'm really very excited about your approach, which is that having identified issues that need addressing in the cases, you're actually proposing using cases and writing cases in order to address those issues. And writing a case is a very quick way of getting that discussion into the classroom, directly into the classroom, where it can make most difference.
I totally agree, Richard. When the conversations get uncomfortable and start to go off a little bit, I just try to use the case as the container to redirect the conversation. Another strategy I tend to use, because often issues will come up in the classroom around the culture of Haas, the social environment, what's happening. While I want those conversations to come up, we're not going to solve systemic racism with one case. So I try to direct it to the case, as well as we are training as business leaders. Let's come back to, what can business leaders do? What can you as an individual inside of the business world do? Just to offer some containers, because we all know that it brings up global issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say one other thing is that we at EGAL actually also have a resource that's a guide around how do you have difficult discussions. It's focused on race and identity. And so it has a particular focus on race, but identity more broadly. And when I stop sharing my screen, I'll put that resource in the chat. It's not necessarily designed for classrooms, but a lot of those points and principles apply in the classroom as well. Richard, I want to maybe if you can share a little bit about this. We wanted to flag the compendium on the Case Center database, and since you were just speaking, do you want to say anything about the Case Center's database and EGAL's compendium, as well as your work around this?
Well, yeah, thanks, Genevieve. We have a database of cases and teaching notes that is around 70,000 cases in size. And we've been working with EGAL and the Case Compendium to try and make it easier to search our database. It's very kind of labor intensive work, because of we're working with existing legacy data. But we're very happy to work with Case Compendium. I think it's a really terrific initiative. and basically it logs metadata, which makes it easier to identify cases that have a DEI focus, diverse protagonists, and non-limiting protagonists. It's work in progress, and it's how I guess it's how we first made contact, isn't it, with EGAL and ourselves, and very happy to be working with you in that.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
we feel the same. We feel absolutely the same. It's been a great partnership.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not always easy to find the cases that have, you know, what the identity of the protagonists in cases, right? Because sometimes that metadata hasn't been captured. A lot of our research was done through kind of looking at abstracts of many cases and descriptions across a couple different leading publishers, including the Case Center. And so if that metadata isn't captured or it's not included within the abstract, then that's really hard. We see that changing a little bit in terms of becoming more common to kind of capture some of this metadata around identity. And so it's becoming more easy to identify those cases, but it is challenging and certainly not all inclusive of all cases that exist, although we did try our best to get the majority of cases out there, or a good chunk of cases out there.
I think one of the problems is that we feel inhibited in going back and revisiting cases and then saying, you know, imposing our interpretation of someone's identity on the protagonist. It's easier to do in the course of writing the case when the protagonist can self-identify, because we don't. It seems ironic that in trying to raise the diversity and describing the diversity of protagonists, we may in some way be imposing our own views and our own values on their own individual identities.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our case compendium work, we from the beginning, we were very conscious about not assuming any identity and only putting the identity of the protagonist that they had kind of self-identified or that they had identified on their LinkedIn. So that was something we were really careful about, and that's definitely a challenge. Any questions from folks? Anything that's come up so far? I know we've had a couple questions and discussion in the chat, but anything else that's kind of top of mind for folks so far? Okay. Well, if you, as questions come up, or as, oh, I'm seeing, yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Well, as questions come up or any other thoughts, definitely use the chat and, you know, keep thinking about some of the challenge or questions that you might have and bringing some of this to life in your own classes. So we're going to do a little activity here. And this activity will get us kind of thinking about some of the challenges within cases and kind of thinking critically about this, and then also starting to think about what concerns we might have around, you know, bringing in different types of protagonists in our cases and in our classrooms, you know, having difficult discussions or discomfort with that, things like that, other challenges that we might anticipate. So we're going to put a link in the chat and have folks read the abstract of a case. And I'm actually going to share in the chat. Here we go. Oh, we do have one question. So before turning to this, Ruchi asks, would be curious about writing cases in a meaningful way and encouraging colleagues to use them. Can you share more about that question, Ruchi, or your point there?
Yeah, and with this takes us off topic, that's totally fine. But one thing that we've been talking about, I actually run a leadership center as well, as how we could be a part of creating new cases to add to this database or however for folks to use. And that might be just also a really great opportunity for our students to engage in writing cases that might be a part of, you know, for undergraduates, their honors classes, or for, you know, graduates, maybe more of a co-curricular opportunity. But I think that, you know, I'll be honest, I feel like I'm maybe getting in my own way of like wanting to really do it right, quote unquote, and then not figuring out how and where to start. I mean, it's like I write cases for my own classes, but this feels like something bigger. And I haven't found traction for myself on where to start with it. But that may be another discussion for another time.
No, it's a good point. Like, where do you start with some of this? And you know, we at EGAL are always interested in partnering with folks that are interested in writing different cases and have different kind of resources and supports that we might be able to offer in terms of writing cases. And I think also thinking about partnering with students is definitely a really great idea. We've definitely had students that have asked their professors, you know, what about a case like this? And I can help write this. And, you know, if you serve as the lead author on this case and we can kind of get this published, there's been a couple instances of that leadership among students, and which is fantastic, right? Identifying the issue and then kind of approaching their professor themselves. So creating the environment for students to be able to approach you on that or others, you know, I think that's a really, you know, it's not necessarily easy, but it's definitely something that we found to be successful.
I think it's also worth bearing in mind that this year's students are likely to be quite similar to recent alumni, and that you know, writing cases about alumni companies or especially local companies can result in cases that are actually more diverse because they and reflect your current student body. And they also have the I think the strength of building ties between the school and local business. So it's definitely worth looking at writing cases around local businesses and businesses that have been set up, entrepreneurial businesses set up by alumni or in which alumni play a prominent part.
Great. So I just put something in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment here. So if everyone could click on the link that is in the chat, and that should take you to a, if you go to the first slide, activity 1, that should take you to a slide that has the directions for the activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into breakout groups of 4 and discuss in your group. First, read the abstract. So it's a short abstract. So read that abstract for maybe 30 seconds or a minute, or probably more like a minute to 2 minutes. And then come back together and discuss, you know, what might be some concerns you have in how the case and protagonist is presented and why. If you were the author, how might you address the concerns and make it more inclusive? And then more broadly, what are some concerns you have related to teaching cases with diverse protagonists, and how do you mitigate those concerns, or how might you mitigate those concerns? So we're going to put folks into those different breakout groups. And okay, you should see a prompt to go in a breakout group now. Okay, welcome back. How was that for folks? What are some of the challenges? What was noticed by your group, and what might be some challenges or concerns in teaching cases with diverse protagonists, especially if you don't identify with the identity of that protagonist? Any thoughts around what was discussed, or share back from your group?
So shall I make a start?
Please.
Yeah, so in our group, like many other groups, we thought the time was very short to discuss it. And our overarching idea here is that we appreciate that the protagonists were non-white and non-male. However, the topic as such, linked to emails and so, you know, wasn't something which we felt was like the starting point we wanted to associate ourselves with. So we had to be, you know, quite cautious here.
Mm-hmm. Tara, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, our discussion was on the relevance of the DEI information in the case. Like, we felt that a lot of it was irrelevant to the case itself. But then the conversation went along the lines of, do you include it or don't you include it? Because if you exclude it, are we all assuming that it's a white man? So we went back and forth. I mean, it was a very short time, but that was kind of along the lines of our discussion is, what do you include? And how relevant is it to the case itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Anyone else? Would anyone else like to share? Violetta.
Hi, Violetta here. I think to sort of speak to Tara's point, the third word being rare is one thing that came up in our conversation. You're already setting a precedence for this person. And in addition, majority of that abstract is really speaking about their qualifications and their background, and trying to make this person seem of the same standard and of the same sort of ability as any other sort of white male. So should it be included or shouldn't it be included? I agree. You'd otherwise, I think it would be a white male. But having all this at the same time, it also does bring to differ that, why do we need to include all this information about them to sort of up their status and their abilities when clearly they can do the role.
Absolutely. And Kathy, why don't you go and then we'll share some thoughts on this. But yeah, definitely the word rare is a bit problematic. Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, inflammatory language in that abstract, agreed. But I think I'd want to see what the case actually read. Like, how is this person portrayed in the case? I might have been an outlier in my group, but I'm willing to consider the possibility that the way the abstract was written was intended for one audience who's identifying cases to use in a course, and the case language itself, there is a non-zero chance that the person may be portrayed in a somewhat different way, and there could be a way to use that case material effectively. And you just hope that your students aren't going to see that abstract. So I would want to take one step further to investigate that.
Yeah, definitely. No, those are all good points for sure. And I think, one of the main concerns that we have with the language was around the word rare, right? Because the selection of the word rare could unintentionally commodify the protagonist, and by painting the protagonist as rare, it reinforces whiteness as the standard. And using words like rare, terms like non-white or rare to describe something or to describe someone can kind of reinforce whiteness as the standard. So it's really important to kind of be aware about that. And some other good practices related to language are avoiding perceived categories and honoring self-identification. So that wasn't necessarily the case in this scenario, but for future case writing and thinking about this, how does the protagonist present themselves and how can that language be reinforced and referenced? So that's just some notes to think about, but definitely the word rare and kind of how that paints whiteness as the standard is something that is a little bit problematic and uncomfortable. I'm going to turn it back over to Kellie to talk about some of the common challenges and roadblocks that we've seen in terms of and heard about in terms of having cases that are either on DEI or that are with cases with diverse protagonists. Kellie, do you want to share some of these challenges? Oh, you're muted.
No, hit it too fast. Yeah, I mean, we've already addressed some of these challenges and roadblocks, but we hear it is uncomfortable. I mean, let me just call it. It is uncomfortable. It would be like somebody coming to me and telling me I needed to teach Pareto optimality in my classroom. It is not what I am trained to do. I want to just call out, I forget who, I want to make Val. Val just sent it, I already printed it. Richard, I'm a printer too, but I write things down on notes. But I really like this article. You can see Val Cortez, I think it was Val, right? Put out, well, I guess it doesn't matter. Put out this, I generally don't use the word safe spaces in the classroom. I do call it brave spaces because it is not safe if you are from a marginalized identity group to have these conversations. So I like this this article has some great tips in it. Let me focus on what I'm talking about here is multitasking on that new article. But, first of all, we have to have the belief that this is important to bring into the classroom. I don't generally get involved in conversations with faculty members who will say this is not important, but I will hear them say, I am already so compressed to do what I need to do. And what our classes, our core courses are 7 weeks. So it's such a compressed timeline. But I am certain people who think we've already talked about this. This is not my job. This is not my area of expertise. So that has to come from leadership and be not have that general disconnection between what leaders of your school say and what faculty are actually held to do in terms of responsibility. I find that our students hold our faculty to the highest level of responsibility on the teaching evaluations. But there is just this, having used the same cases over time and feeling comfortable with that, I can certainly relate to that. The incentive structure to change right now, as I said, in our school, the incentive structure is really students who are demanding this and putting into the evaluation, the faculty evaluation system, that this is something they want to see more of. We are really refuting the no good cases available or unsure how to find such cases. So really getting this case compendium in as many hands as possible, financially supporting faculty members and or others to write cases if there is no good case. So there's a part of our compendium link that says, if you can't find a case that you're looking for, let us know, and we will do what we can to try to find case writers and content. But there is this sort of lack of funding. The confidence piece, one thing that we are doing at Haas, our chief diversity officer has just hired a faculty coach, for lack of a better term, which is a trained DEI facilitator who can really serve as a coach for this last bullet point for faculty members who say, I'm not comfortable bringing this up in the classroom. That is an absolutely real and valid concern. So I'll let you know, this has just happened. The coach has not yet started, but I'm excited about what Haas is doing in that space. Next slide, Jen. So again, sharing research on the impact. So, showing that this is a critical value add for business schools. The pledge, my belief is that if we can get this professor pledge signed off, why can't we create a Slack or whatever the right community is of professors who are really trying and challenging themselves to bring this into their classroom and share tips? I mean, just the crowdsourcing of ideas, just what is happening here. Supposedly I'm an expert, I am not, but supposedly I am. And yet I'm every day reminded how little I know and how many better methodologies there are out there. The case center search function has a lot of value to add as well. So that, these excuses, we just try to refute these excuses to the best of our ability. Engaging with us, EGAL, we are set up to support cases. And Genevieve mentioned our language practices, around how to navigate these conversations. I believe it's better to, I guess I just think if I'm going to go down as a failure, I'd rather be a failure for trying to navigate really tricky stuff in the classroom than all the other reasons I could go down as a failure. But if I had to just zero in on one thing, I think it really is to develop resources to support one another in the classroom through these difficult, challenging things to navigate. Kate, it was you on the safe and brave spaces. Sorry to misattribute you, but at least I was attributing it to another woman and not to a man, which we know happens. So a little bit. Thank you also for your other link. Christina, I see your hand up. You're on mute. Famous Zoom move.
Yeah. Now can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I am not a case writer. I am not a case teacher. I am an administrator of cases at IMD in Switzerland. And actually, for me, the fact of gathering metadata about the cases and these kind of DEI things, it's a bit complicated because, for me, it's very sensitive to put tags on people. In an ideal world, we shouldn't even be doing this. We should be normal. But I think it's important that the case writer has a conversation with the protagonist at some point, because for GDPR reasons, these are kind of sensitive data that we are not really supposed to keep in our records and things like that.
Right.
And there needs to be a conversation at some point. Why are we doing this? What is it for? So, so that the person can approve if this is data that we can keep about the person or not. So on an administrative part, I just wanted to raise this challenge.
Christina, is that linked to the EU mandate that companies aren't allowed to collect broader demographic data?
Yeah, actually, yeah. In the GDPR data protection law, it's we really need to explain to the person why we collect this kind of data. And these kind of data are also classified as sensitive data, as for example, name, address, and things like that is not. But this is data that is sensitive. So and also I just wanted to make an example. My father-in-law was handicapped, physically handicapped, that he was an architect, and we would never. It never happened that anybody would bother about his handicap for drawing a house.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I am a bit. I'm not at ease with asking people like this because I think normally it should not be an issue. So putting these tags on people is delicate, I think.
It certainly is. And I think one way that Harvard Business Publishing is working on this now is there's a form that actually protagonists are asked to fill out. So they can self-identify and select. And if they don't want to identify, they don't have to identify as well. So there's kind of it's able to allow the person to have that ability, and then they're told what will be made public. And so it's a very transparent process, which is interesting, but really good considerations. We hadn't thought fully about kind of the GDPR considerations around data protection. So that's super interesting, something to think about more. I know we're just about at time. So I'm just going to speed through a couple quick final pieces, which here's just a quick checklist that you can use and ask yourself. And this is just to kind of, reference when you're thinking about using a case. There's a couple questions. Does this case include a protagonist that represents marginalized identities? Does this case utilize language that's empowering and does not perpetuate limiting stereotypes and norms? And then in writing a case, some key questions to ask yourself: how might I integrate protagonists that represent different lived experiences and identities? How might I honor and integrate self-identification of the protagonist? So what we were just talking about. How might I use language that's respectful and empowering without amplifying limiting norms? And how might I integrate a DEI lens into this case? So these are just some questions that you can use for yourself when using cases or writing cases, and kind of helps you to think about some of these considerations. And then just a couple, key takeaways. So they're really, there are great opportunities to use cases with diverse protagonists and integrate concepts of equity and inclusion in cases and case discussions. And remember, in writing, think about how might you prioritize protagonists with different identities and really incorporate intersectionality and target core courses as well with cases, and ensure that language used in cases and in classic discussions doesn't commodify or potentially discriminate against certain identities or perpetuate stereotypes and harmful norms. We'll share after this session in an email, have the case centers share out some of our language work, good practices of advancing language for equity and inclusion that you can reference and take into your courses. And then partnering with EGAL and with the Case Center to help write and identify cases to use. So there's a couple links at the bottom of this page of different resources you have, and we'll also share those after this session as well. And then I want to just make one plug for our Professor Pledge. So Kellie mentioned this before, but the Professor Pledge is a commitment from professors at business schools globally to utilize and advance cases with diverse protagonists and cases on topics related to DEI. So this pledge, and we've gotten professors all over the world that have signed the pledge, is a pledge to support inclusive curriculum material, advance a sense of belonging among diverse students and better equip them for success, and really join us in building a more equitable educational environment in business world. So please do take this pledge. If I would love to, I will stop sharing real quick and just put the link in the chat. But we have really big thank you to everyone for having us here today. And let me put the Professor Pledge in the chat before we end our call here, but very much appreciate this opportunity to discuss our work and this really important topic. And thank you so much for engaging with it. Apologies for going a couple minutes over. I know that we could probably talk about this for a lot longer, and there's definitely more to dig into this. So, appreciate this as an initial dive into the conversation. Hope that we can, you find some of these resources helpful in your own work, and definitely do reach out to us at EGAL. Kellie, do you want to say any final words?
No, I'm just really excited, and thanks for sharing all the resources. And I think one of the takeaways for me is how to keep this kind of crowdsourcing community together and live. And maybe we can talk about that in addition to everything Genevieve said, because I learned so much from my peers, and I just really appreciate that. And thank you so much for sharing this hour with us today.
Yes.
Black, yeah, Val's a fountain of ideas.
Thank you, everyone. Richard, I think you're on mute, but we'll turn it back over to you. And again, appreciate everyone for staying a couple minutes over for this great conversation. And thank you so much for coming.
Well, shall I step in, Richard, just to say thank you so much. We were really pleased to support the work at EGAL, and also to arrange this webinar with you both. It's been really informative, really useful. We'll send out as many links and resources as possible. And any future conversations, keep them going, as you say, either through ourselves or directly with EGAL and Kellie and Genevieve. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been really terrific. Thank you everyone for coming along. I've been so excited about it, and I'm really frustrated that we couldn't spend all day talking about this.
Yeah.
I hope we can find a way of having a much longer session in future, and we'll be able to run something there. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's session. Zoom should pop up a link to the feedback form in the browser window, but we'll also include a feedback link in the email that we send you tomorrow. If you'd like to do a deeper dive into case teaching or case writing, please check out our workshops program. And for new case teachers or new case writers, please also take a look at our case teaching and case writing scholarships program. The email tomorrow will have links to those, and it will also include a link to a recording of today's session. Thanks again to Kellie and Genevieve. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and been really informative and energetic and interesting and bright and intelligent and everything that we all hope we can be. And also to everyone who's taken part, for your energy, engagement and intention. Thank you for attending. Stay safe and healthy, and goodbye. I hope to see you all again soon.